In a Farmington cemetery, there is a tombstone that marks the grave of Foon, a West African who died in 1841 while bathing in the nearby river. Foon was one of a group of 53 kidnapped West Africans who successfully broke the bonds of slavery and galvanized anti-slave forces in the years preceding the Civil War. This Amistad Rebellion led to the first civil rights case in the United States.
In 1838, a group of Africans, Mende, from the area of Africa we now know as Sierra Leone, it was brought, kidnapped actually, by a Portuguese and put on a Portuguese ship and brought to Cuba. There, 53 of them were bought by two men and put on a ship named the Amistad.
They were transferred to be taken to the other side of the island where they were going to be enslaved. And on the way to the other side, there was a rebellion aboard the ship, led by a Mende leader called Cinque. The rebellion lasted approximately a day, and the ship was captured by these 53 Africans. They killed the captain and kept two of the crew alive so they could steer the ship back to Africa. During the day, the crew would sail toward Africa because Cinque reasoned that they had come this way toward the rising sun, so they should sail back toward the setting sun. The two members obeyed his orders during the day, but at night they turned inland, hoping that they would be captured.
And this zigzagging course led it for this little over a month up the coast here. They finally landed, almost waterless, foodless, emaciated, off of Montauk, which is the most northern point of Long Island. And there, the Africans got in a boat and went on shore. A U.S. naval ship under the command of a Captain Gedney found these Africans in the boat, captured them, and took them to New Haven and jailed them. And there begins this Amistad case.
The abolitionist movement at that time in the United States was in somewhat disarray. And the Amistad Africans landing here was kind of a God-sent rallying point.
There was fear that agitation on the slavery issue would destroy the Union. Congress refused or passed a resolution denying the right of any congressperson to debate the issue of slavery, even mention it. The significance is that the abolitionists, in order to dramatize the evils of slavery in American society, used the Amistad case and other issues.
Students at Yale University rallied around the cause. They went, raised money, they taught the Africans how to read and write. Missionaries came in and gave them lessons in Christianity, helped to convert them. They became a kind of a very famous group.
It was kind of almost a circus scene from time to time because the jailer was actually charging for people to come by and take a look at these Africans.
There were a lot of wild stories that sensational. The New York press, for instance, the Herald, showed all kinds of drawings of the captives, making them 1.5 times their size. They exercised on the green, and they actually did some flips and things. These were emphasized all out of proportion. So the media sensationalized the story.
Connecticut was the staging place for all of this, and there were some unique things that Connecticut brought to it. The whole fact that up in the New England area here, you had Louis Tappan, people very much involved in the anti-slavery movement. They formed something called the Amistad Committee.
It was a very sensational case because President Van Buren, of course, was under pressure from the Spanish government, and he was under pressure from southern states and southern senators and congressmen to return the Amistad victims to in quote, their owners. But the facts of the case showed that these people had been illegally kidnapped.
Abolitionist Louis Tappan, who had a summer home in New Haven, funded much of the defense for the West Africans. Charges of mutiny and murder were dismissed by U.S. Circuit Court in Hartford, which noted that the revolt took place in Cuban waters, but a number of conflicting claims still needed to be addressed. The case went to federal district court in New Haven, where Roger Sherman Baldwin argued for the Mendi. Most importantly, the question as to whether the Africans were part of the ship's cargo or were they free men had to be resolved. The Spanish government sought the return of the ship, its cargo, and the Africans, who would be tried as murderers. The U.S. wanted to avoid a diplomatic crisis and supported Spain. The Cuban slave traders also wanted custody. The anti-slave forces argued that since the importation of slaves from Africa had been made illegal by the Spanish, the 36 surviving Africans had been kidnapped and were therefore free. The case, with dramatic testimony by Shungay and others, was a sensation, forcing the nation to confront the slavery issue. Presiding District Judge Andrew Judson issued a stunning ruling that the Africans had indeed been kidnapped illegally and were free to return to Africa. But the U.S. appealed to Federal Circuit Court in Hartford, which upheld the decision. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court 1 year later.
Perhaps the most dramatic thing about the actual trial that went on is that former President John Quincy Adams argued it before the Supreme Court. Adams was quite old by this time, and the anti-slavery people were the ones who really imposed upon him and begged him really to argue this case. The key issue, however, turned on the claim that the Spanish had made that they owned the property. Indeed, what the court found was that the documents that the Spanish produced to prove ownership were forged. They had backdated them so that it would appear that they had not been bought in the period during which enslavement was now illegal. The court missed an opportunity to say that enslavement was immoral and illegal. The Constitution at this time left it up to the states to decide whether or not they wished to keep enslavement. If the court had said it was illegal, it would, of course, thrown the political balance totally out of whack here. Instead, they did rule on these narrow grounds that enslavement was illegal in Spain, and that the importation of enslavement to the U.S. was illegal, and that the documents were fraudulent. So they got rid of all those claims, and the court said, okay, you are free, which meant, of course, you got to get back home the best way you can. What that did, of course, was put the anti-slavery people back in motion again.
So they brought them to Farmington, which at that time was an important abolitionist town where they stayed for 6 months. And the abolitionists arranged for them to travel throughout Connecticut and parts of New England.
They would read the Bible, they would speak. Shungay would give talks. They were basically going around earning money by defeating the stereotypes. They collected enough money for their passage. They got back to Sierra Leone in 1841.